Good morning from NA, good afternoon from Europe, and good evening to all the 6 of you watching from Asia. Today is Wednesday, we are getting the reset of this week in Europe as well. We have Sepulchre Raid as the raid of choice to be fated this week, and with this week we have gotten a whole bunch of nerfs. A tiny nerf in the raid and a massive swing of nerfs to dungeons for Mythic Plus for this week. So let's go over the bigger nerf first, let's go over what matters first, which is the Mythic Plus nerfs to the dungeons. Now, we have gotten a couple of weeks by now into this season, and a few things were quite obvious to be recognized, which is the difficulty of certain dungeons compared to others. I'm sure that if you jumped in Streets or in Gambit for Tazavesh dungeons just like Season 3, you didn't find too much of a difference. The dungeons were still fine. They weren't even hard dungeons in Season 3. After Blizzard dropped the Nerf hammer on them multiple times, they became quite decent dungeons to complete, so they were quite easy to do. And then you had the 2 Mechagon dungeons, which were also kind of nice. Both Junkyard and Workshop were working out quite well, and then you had a few more problems in Grimrail Depot, particularly the last boss was kind of rough. But then you had the worst of the worst, which were Iron Docks, Upper Karazhan, and then Lower Karazhan, in particularly the 2 Karazhan dungeons. As you can see here, this is the completion for all of the keys, and you can see the drastic difference. Even just getting in the plus 15 range, you can see the difference between the 2 Karazhan dungeons and all of the rest. You're essentially 3 times, even close to 4 times more likely to complete a Gambit key or a Streets key than to complete Upper or Lower Karazhan. And then of course it gets worse and worse once you go higher in keys. Even better to be shown in here in the distribution, you can see the very tiny green bars of the Karazhan dungeons compared to the blue, light blue and yellow colors of the Tazavesh dungeons and of Junkyard. If we were to take a guess, those would have been the dungeons that should have been nerfed a little bit more. And in fact, to no surprise, these are the dungeons that are getting nerfed this reset. Upper Karazhan, Lower Karazhan and Iron Docks are the 3 dungeons that have been targeted by the most nerfs. So let's go with the smaller nerf, which is the one to Grimrail Depot. One of the possibly one-shotty, possibly group wiping mechanic is the Grimrail Technician's 50,000 volt cast. This is the cast that does a ton of damage, arcs between players, but also, more importantly, stuns you. And this has now been nerfed to have a much longer cast time. Instead of 2.5 seconds, now the cast time is 3.5 seconds. So you definitely need to be sleeping to let this cast go through, especially considering how dangerous it is. Also, there is a nerf, which isn't really a nerf in and of itself, but rather a visibility buff to the encounter, which is Skylar Tovra, the last boss of Grimrail Depot. Freezing Snare, so the trap that she throws at players, now has a new animation and a pretty massive and unmissable beam of light coming out of the trap to make sure you don't step on it by mistake. Spinning Spear, the one that gets thrown to players, now shows a stunned indicator when hit by the attack, just in case the healer doesn't realize what's happening. But more importantly, the main mechanic of Skylar Tovra, Thunderous Breath, now the ability itself gets divided into 2. You have the initial breath, and then you have the swirlies on the ground, which signify the arrival of diffused energy, which is the lightning pool that stays on the ground and gives you the dot of the damage. So now you can just move out before the dot actually gets applied. It's gonna be much easier, and more importantly, you're gonna be taking much less damage in the last boss of Grimrail Depot because of this visibility change of the mechanics of the fight. But then let's move to the actual nerfs, the actual meaty nerfs, starting with Iron Docks. So the main problem of Iron Docks, generally speaking, was the trash. And generally speaking, it was the first part of the trash is quite brutal. All of the first pack of mobs before the first boss. Certain abilities of those packs were hitting super hard. And what was the issue? It was unavoidable, undodgeable stuff. It was the charge that left behind a massive bleed from the foot soldiers. It was the cannon shot that left behind the magical dot on players. This used to hurt a lot. So, the nerfs in question. Charging Slash is now cast only by the Gromkar foot soldiers, no longer by the battle masters as well. This is good because the foot soldiers have like a third of the HP of the battle masters, so getting rid of the Charging Slash from the battle master will mean way less bleeds being thrown around to your party. And then the foot soldiers Charging Slash is nerfed in damage by 35%, which is also quite good. That was a very heavy hitting dot on you. Orgron Laborer's Thundering Stomp damage has been reduced by 25%. This is of course the big guy. The big guy and his stomp gets nerfed. Thunderlord Wrangler's Throw damage is now reduced by armor. That was extremely dangerous for tanks. It was something that not many tanks paid attention to. These guys used to move away from the tank, and as soon as they moved away from the tank and was out of melee range, they would just spam throw. Problem is, this throw, even at lower-ish keys like a +20, were hitting for like 60k damage on the tank because armor wasn't being considered. So the damage was massive. Now this damage is completely ignorable from tanks. The armor reduction will make it hit for much less and not really be a threat to a tank anymore. Lastly, Rampaging Clefttooth's health has been reduced by 15%. Those were quite annoying, both because they enraged and because of the charge they did, so it's nice to make them die a little bit quicker. These are the nerfs to Iron Docks. I would have liked to see perhaps a little nerf to the Incinerators, the ones that spam the Incendiary Slug, the one that spam the magical damage dot, the debuff on you. It gets kind of annoying when there is multiples of them and you only have as a healer one dispel at a time and it starts to hit quite a bit. It was particularly deadly when they would target one of the players with already the bleed on them, so they would get double dot on them, hitting for like 40k per tick. That was quite nasty, but at the very least, with the nerf to the Charging Slash bleed, this Incendiary Slug won't be as dangerous anymore. After Iron Docks, we have the nerfs to the Karazhan dungeons, starting with Lower Karazhan, which is the one that gets nerfed by far the most. Arcane Warden's Volatile Charge damage has been reduced by 40%, Skeletal Usher's Flashlight damage has been reduced by 20%, as well as the Skeletal Usher's health being reduced by 25%. Now, the Skeletal Ushers weren't really that big of an issue. Yes, you might have learned by now that if you turn away from their flashlight, you don't get blinded, but you were still taking damage. At the same time, you might not know that if you line of sight the Skeletal Ushers behind the many pillars, the many nooks and crannies in that corridor, you are not even gonna take the damage. So the nerf to the damage of the ability wasn't even that needed if you were line of sighting the ability to begin with. Spectral Patron's Uppercut damage has been reduced by 20%, and the Phantom Crew's Hammer Down now has a 1.5 second cast time when it used to be instant, and increases the damage taken by 25% when it was 50%. So these last two are quite good in terms of tank damage when you go through that entire gauntlet of ghosts, both the uppercut damage being reduced and the hammer down having a cast time and reducing the damage the tank takes is quite good in that part of the Lower Karazhan dungeon. Then we have the nerfs to the actual bosses of Lower Karazhan, which can also be quite annoying. Perhaps not the Opera Hall event, that's not that problematic, but still, the Beautiful Beast gets nerfed this week. Cogglestone's Dent Armor now has a 1.5 second cast time when it used to be instant, and Silverfork's Bloody Jab, the initial damage of the jab, has been reduced by 20%. The more important nerfs, however, are to the Maiden and to Atumen. Maiden gets Holy Bulwark Absorb reduced by 10%. So, in case you were wiping because you didn't have your damage for the breaking of the shield, now it's going to be easier. And then you have the nerf to Atumen, which is the Intangible Presence damage. That's actually pretty massive because the dot left behind by the spooky ghost hidden amongst one of your players until the healer or until the group realizes who it is and it gets dispelled. Until that is removed, the dot used to tick for a lot of damage. Now the dot is doing 50% less damage. So you're gonna be punished a little bit less if you are a little bit slower in figuring out who is the target that needs to be dispelled. Surprisingly, no changes to the damage of Moros and his bleed. I guess they thought that wasn't that big of an issue. They have left him on its own, pretty much. Then you have the other side of Karazhan that gets nerfed, which is Upper Karazhan. This wasn't as bad as Lower Karazhan just by looking at the key completion and whatnot. Lower Karazhan was worse than Upper Karazhan. Still, Upper gets some nerfs. The Wrathguard's Flamebringer's cleave and strike damage has been reduced by 20%, as well as the Wrathguard Flamebringer no longer casting slide. Pretty interesting of Blizzard to designate 2 different nerfs to a single mob. There is just one of these guys in the entire dungeon right before the corridor to Medivh, and it gets 2 nerfs. Also, this mob was so annoying and so just unnecessary to deal with that many groups started to use stealth to dodge this mob altogether. So maybe now that it gets nerfed, some more groups are going to try to deal with him rather than just skip him entirely. Then you have the nerfs to the bosses. Shade of Medivh and Mana Devourer are the ones getting nerfs. Shade of Medivh has Guardian Image's Shimmer damage reduced by 25%. This was quite a different change from back in the day in Legion. The Shimmer spam damage of the 3 birds wasn't even, like, it wasn't the worst part of the encounter by a mile. Yet in this rebooted version in Shadowlands, it was actually very heavy damage around the group, even with a few interrupts here and there. The stacking increased damage of the shimmer spam of these birds was very dangerous. So now it gets nerfed by 25% in damage. And then you have the Mana Devourer, who gets the energy discharge damage reduced by 30%. This was just the massive blast of damage he would do every once in a while. That was quite dangerous, of course, as well at high keys. Now gets nerfed by almost a third of its damage. And then you have a surprising nerf. I say surprising because we don't really think this dungeon deserved a nerf, which is Gambit. Solia's Gambit gets a nerf, and it gets a nerf in perhaps the most frustrating of the abilities, right? If you go back to think about Gambit, what's really frustrating sometimes, that is obviously the fish stick. The cast of the Scalebanders of invigorating fish sticks, healing back the entire pack of mobs. Now this cast time is increased to 2 seconds from 1.5 seconds. So this will leave more room for your players to react with their stuns, with their disorients, with their knockups or knockbacks to stop the cast of this ability, which is ultimately the most dangerous part of the entire Murloc camp of this dungeon, because you go in the pack with all of your burst, all of your CDs, the tank uses all of his defensive cooldowns, and then all of those CDs expire and the mobs are still at full HP because a fish stick was let cast, it wasn't killed in time, so now you are all out of juice and the mobs are still at full HP. It becomes quite dangerous to keep tanking those mobs, so now it's made a little bit easier to prevent a situation like that from happening. I said we were going on the changes to the dungeons first because the changes to the raids are much more simple. Blizzard is not really tinkering too much with bosses in particular, because of course there are 3 different raids with 31 total bosses, and they also rotate every week. So instead, Blizzard goes for a much more broad type of nerf, which is enemy health reduced by 5% in Fated Heroic and in Fated Mythic difficulty. So all of the enemy things with health in the raids are going to be reduced by 5% flat. That is the nerf applied to the raids this reset. As a finish, not that it's gonna matter too much because the trinkets are still mostly garbage, but Blizzard is tuning a little bit better the trinkets from Warlords of Draenor pool of loot. The Enforcer's Stun Grenade gets its versatility buff almost doubled compared to what it has it right now. Then you have the Flash Render's Meat Hook intellect being increased by 17%, and then Kira's Adrenaline Injector's intellect being increased by 17%. So just in case you have looted these trinkets and perhaps they were absolutely garbage, or just in case you find these trinkets being offered to you from the Great Vault, maybe now they might be worth picking up now that they have gotten buffed. Just as a reminder. These have been all of the changes in this reset for Mythic Plus dungeons and for the raid bosses. We will see eventually how much different, how much more change the tuning to Sepulcher have gotten, because you know, just 15 days ago Sepulcher was still current content, so I wonder if they actually changed it at all compared to a couple of weeks ago. We will see this week how things are going. These were for now all of the changes Blizzard has brought in this new week. of Season 4. And this will be all there is to talk about for today. Tomorrow, likely, we are getting the new build in the alpha, we are getting a new zone, higher max level for characters, and more importantly, the new class talents. Likely, by the time you watch this video, that is going to be already announced by Blizzard, and according to my sources of looking at which data mining has gotten more progress, Monk should be the class to have its talent released, and indeed, Demon Hunter looks like it's going to be the last one of the two to get its talents revealed. But I will see tomorrow. I will see tomorrow back where you are right now. Currently, you are about 24 hours in the future. I am still not there, so I will see tomorrow if I was correct. For today, however, we can stop. Thank you guys, of course, for watching the video, and of course, as usual, a round of applause to all of my patrons for supporting me. This is a big help in continuing to produce content for WoW as we get deeper in Season 4 and closer to the release of Dragonflight. There's going to be more and more content to talk about, more exciting content to speculate about the state of all of the specs and classes as we get closer to Dragonflight, but for now, this is what we have to work with. Of course, as usual, you can also like and comment down below on this video and also subscribe to the channel itself. That would be a good help. And for further final social simping behavior, you can follow me on Twitter as well as subscribing to my Patreon right down at these two links. Okay, with all of this out of the way, we can now stop and leave each other to the rest of this reset. Thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon. And in the meantime, I don't know. I think right now we are a little bit above my comfort standards. I think 32 degrees is a little bit too much, especially if you have to stay in front of the PC. So please drop it down just 3 to 4 degrees for tomorrow. Okay? Thank you.